So what we're going to do this morning and finish up this afternoon is to have a basic introduction to calcium homeostasis. Many of you are familiar, but it's always good to kind of review the system. And then we'll talk about hypercalcemic states and hypocalcemic states. Tomorrow morning, at the end of today, I will give you an intro to the hypoparathyroid states, and then Dr. Rubin will give you a much more detailed presentation of that condition. Okay. So I like to start very, very simply, and this is about as simple diagram as you can imagine when it comes to the organ systems that are classically involved in calcium homeostasis. And on the left is this little doggy bone. That's the skeleton, of course. And this is the GI tract. This is the kidney. And this is the intravascular compartment. So classically, these three organ systems talk to each other and are regulated so as to keep our serum calcium within normal limits and also to keep our skeleton fully mineralized. And so the diagram becomes very complicated all of a sudden because this is obviously a very dynamic situation. And if you look at the GI tract, you know, the typical intake in a person is somewhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams per day. In this country, it's, anybody have any idea how much we take in on average, women versus men? Do we take in on average 1,000? No. Do we take in average 500? No. Actually, there are countries that take in about 500. For example, in Hong Kong, the average intake is about 470. Asian countries tend to take in less because maybe of issues of GI tolerance. But their percent absorption is much greater. The average percent absorption of the dietary calcium in this country is about 35% or so. So typically, a woman, man, is somewhere between 700 to 800 milligrams per day. That is both coming from the diet and from calcium supplements. So a certain amount of that calcium is absorbed, and that amount of absorbed is, again, very variable. There is a certain amount of calcium that's secreted into the gastrointestinal tract. So there is a net absorption that is, on average, again in this stylized case, of about 150 to 300, which is the amount of calcium, if we're in calcium balance, that's the amount of calcium that the kidney will let go to give us what comes in, what goes out, and we're not growing. That is, adults are not growing. This is an adult scheme, and hopefully we're not losing. So these two features are matched. Did Tom Nicholas tell you yesterday that the kidney was the smartest organ in the body? He doesn't boast. But the kidney is a pretty smart organ. And in this regard, it filters a lot of calcium. 10,000 milligrams of calcium per day, and only lets out a smidgen, which is to say most of the calcium that's filtered is reclaimed by tubular mechanisms, which is quite amazing when you think about it. And then we come to the skeleton. And again, the typical turnover in an adult is somewhere between 300 and 500 milligrams per day, which means that we are losing about that much and we are accruing about that much if we're in calcium balance. So that's a lot of calcium when you think about it. You know, the serving of dairy is somewhere between 300 and 400. Glass of milk, for example, a cup of yogurt, serving of cheese. So we're really turning over a lot of calcium every day in the skeleton. So some of our specialists in other fields, like the cardiologists, you know, they like to think that the heart is pumping every second and the most dynamic organ. No. We're just as dynamic as any other organ. We're doing a lot. The bone is really very, very active. And to focus on the skeleton, you can see that this dynamic has to be balanced, or there is going to be trouble. So how does the body allow that control to be operative, that we aren't in negative calcium balance, and that our serum calcium is maintained within normal limits? And these are obviously the two principal controlling hormones, parathyroid hormone. And I think all of you are familiar with parathyroid hormone. The sequence of parathyroid hormone was determined many, many years ago, 1968, famous paper by Auerbach and Potts at NIH, which delineated the primary sequence of this 84 amino acid molecule. And what Potts and Auerbach did, and remember in those days, we didn't understand that you could teach bacteria how to make human proteins. We had no idea how to do it. Recombinant DNA technology, nobody had any idea. So how would you make a protein? You first had to determine the sequence, and then to reconstruct it, you would have to add residues from the amino terminal one by one by one by one. A very laborious and expensive process. So some of you may wonder, why do we talk about PTH 1 to 34, teriparatide, when that is not the native hormone? And in fact, the body, the human body, and no other body, has no real recognition other than it being a PTH. There's nothing special about PTH 1 to 34. If you look at the metabolism of the entire full-length molecule, it doesn't get chopped at the amino acid 34 residue. Probably gets metabolized at somewhere the 30. Andy Stewart has suggested that the cleavage point is more likely to be a PTH 1 to 36. So why are we talking about this 34 amino acid foreshortened component of the full-length molecule? There's a very pragmatic answer, and it goes back to the difficulty of making proteins in those days. So what Auerbach and Potts did was to play with these various lengths of peptide, and they realized that PTH 1 to 34 contained all of the classical biological properties of the full-length molecule. Now, what does classical mean? Classical means that if you give PTH, urinary cyclic AMP goes up. If you give PTH, urinary phosphorus goes up. If you give PTH, urinary calcium goes down, because PTH is a calcium conserving hormone. And so they got to this molecule, PTH 1 to 34, and it was much easier to make, obviously, than an 84 amino acid. They also appreciated that if you locked off this first amino acid, you lost all biological activity. So PTH 1 was key, and you didn't need to go further than PTH 1 to 34, so they stopped there and they called it teriparatide. In 1969, nobody thought that teriparatide would have any potential as a therapy for osteoporosis. Although in those days, people were beginning to remember that Fuller Albright in the 1930s, when all we knew about PTH was that you could extract it from bovine parathyroid glands and inject it and get the same kind of activities. But Fuller-Albright also showed that if you gave this crude extract to rats, you could completely sclerose the bone marrow, the inner part of bone. And he actually wondered whether under certain circumstances PTH could be an anabolic agent. It's amazing. And nobody did anything about that idea for 40 years. And then in the late 60s and then thereafter, the concept grew up, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so this is teriparatide. We appreciate what teriparatide is. And the full-length molecule we appreciate, actually more than we used to, with regard to it as a therapeutic agent for hypoparathyroidism, not as a therapeutic agent for osteoporosis. So we're going to talk later about why would we favor the full-length molecule as a replacement hormone for hypopara when we use the foreshortened version when it comes to using this peptide as a treatment for osteoporosis. There are important differences in these molecules. The other point about this is this, the rest of this molecule, which is the mid to C-terminal fragment. And nobody really knows why PTH is as long as PTH is. It's a relatively small molecule anyway. But why does the body go to the trouble of making such a long peptide when it isn't clear what the mid and the C-terminal portions of the molecule are doing? And nobody has quite figured this out yet. There was some work in Canada, in Toronto, that suggested Tim Murray was the person for many years, and in Boston, Rick Bringhurst for many years, tried to identify a specific receptor for this portion of the molecule. And it really hasn't panned out. We really don't have any insight into whether there are specific receptors for this part of the molecule. This part of the molecule doesn't have any known biological activity, although you might think it could. But anyway, it's a little bit of a mystery as to why PTH 184 is PTH 184. Okay. So we have a molecule that has very important properties. But this molecule, as is true for any hormone, is controlled very exquisitely. And with regard to parathyroid hormone, it is the ionized calcium that is the controller. And it controls the serum calcium in such a way that unless we are dealing with a disease, our serum calciums are always normal. So what does normal mean? How do you know what normal is? So how do we define normal? You get a laboratory value, you know, the BUN, creatinine. There is a definition of normal. And the definition of normal is that you take a population, it could be the next 200 people coming into this hospital, allegedly normal, and you measure whatever. You measure the blood calcium, and you get a mean, and you can run a standard deviation around that mean. For a clinical lab, it'll take the mean and run it at plus or minus 2 standard deviations. And that will capture 95% of that population. Okay? So that means that 2.5% of the normal population will be out here, a fringe group, and 2.5% of the population will be on this side, a fringe group, and they will appear to be abnormal. They either have hypocalcemia or hypercalcemia. But if the normal range is capturing only 95% of the population, it is possible that these people who are on the fringe are really not abnormal. They just are living at a different level. If you were to define normal as plus or minus 3 standard deviations, then the tail would be much more narrow. Be like, I think, 1% or maybe 0.5%. Okay? So remember, what is normal? Normal is relative. And it doesn't mean that if you're a little bit off the normal range that you're necessarily abnormal. Okay? Now, the other thing that's very important is the following. Your serum calcium and my serum calcium does not have an excursion of 2 standard deviations around the mean. You don't get up one morning and have your calcium's 8.4, and the next day your calcium's 10.2. No way. No way. Your calcium and my calcium has a much more narrow comfort zone, much more narrow than the population normal. And this is true for anything you measure. So if you measure my calcium day in and day out and your calcium day in and day out, we're not going to move very much. 9.2, and we might vary between 9.0 and 9.4. And this is important when we talk about normal calcemic hyperpara. And I don't know that we have a whole presentation. I think Shawnee may talk about normal calcemic hyperpara. But you all know about this concept of normal calcemic hyperpara. Well, suppose this person who is, whose calcium is in this range becomes hyperparathyroid, and the serum calcium on average now goes up by almost 1 mg/% and is running at 9.8 or 9.9. It's still normal, right? But for that patient has become hypercalcemic. The only way you can know that would be to know what her or his serum calcium was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And we don't really have that information. When we capture all of our medical record in a little chip, and it's shared all over the world, you can go back 10 years, 20 years, and this is all fanciful, of course, and know that my calcium used to be around 9.2 10 years ago, and now it's running 9.9, and my PTH is 92. So this concept of normocalcemic hyperpara may relate to this point of the narrow normal range in a given patient having increased, but still within the population normal range. Okay? Good. So this is it. This is what you and I live with, a normal serum calcium. And those excursions up and down are very, very minimal. They reflect feeding and they reflect fasting. So after eating a calcium-enriched meal, our calcium will truly go up a little bit. And after an evening and no intake of food or no intake of calcium, the calcium will go down a little bit. But this little wobble in this line is not going to be detected easily by a blood serum calcium measurement because the range is too narrow. All right, so let me give you a little bit more about how exquisitely this system is controlled. This is a very interesting experiment that was done by Bob Heaney. Bob Heaney is one of the great calcium nutritionists of our time from the University of Nebraska. And Bob ran this interesting study. He took 24 healthy postmenopausal women and gave them a small calcium load, 500 milligrams, and he used 3 different calcium supplement preparations. And what he showed was that for each of these 3 preparations, it didn't matter which one it was, the parathyroid hormone level very, very quickly fell. and then rose back to baseline over the next day. This was the placebo group that didn't get any calcium supplement up here. So as a function of a rather small amount of calcium intake, the PTH drops by a lot. Okay? So what did happen to the serum calcium in this experiment? Well, it looks like it went up a lot. Where this is the control. And here's the graph you've already seen. But look at the excursion. 9.65, 9.7 to 10.2. So we expanded the y-axis. Yeah, it did change a little bit. But if you look at it this way, it didn't change very much at all. In fact, the change was about a 1 to 2% increase in the serum calcium after that small amount of calcium supplement. And look at what happens. There was this 40% drop in PTH. Okay, so this happens all the time. This is always happening. And one thing that I don't know, because no one has been able to study this carefully, but you know this idea of the stochastic pulsatility of parathyroid hormone? Have you heard of it? Do you know what stochastic means? It's a very interesting word. I like to use that word because no one knows what it means. No, stochastic means random, totally random. So people talk about the stochastic pulsatility of PTH, a little bit like the gonadotropin releasing hormone. There's stochastic pulsatility. And that means that there are bursts of hormone secretion that are not easily explained. So with regard to parathyroid hormone, there are pulses of PTH. If you do every 3-minute measurements of PTH in a 24-hour period, you'll find anywhere from 10 to 20 pulses. And these pulses could be up to twice the baseline level of parathyroid hormone. And we call this stochastic, random. But is it? If you could really track these little tiny changes in the serum calcium, as the serum calcium goes up by 1 or 2%, the PTH drops by 40%. Well, similarly, as the serum calcium drops by 1 or 2%, maybe the PTH gets stimulated. So maybe this stochastic pulsatility is really a reflection of these minimal changes that are too narrow for us to really be able to measure on a regular basis. But anyway, stochastic pulsatility is part of parathyroid hormone secretory dynamics. An additional part of PTH secretory dynamics is the circadian dynamics. In the morning, like steroid hormones, in the morning our PTH wakes up and will go up by about 25% from its baseline. And in the late afternoon, again, just like steroid hormone, our PTH will kind of diminish and it'll drop by about 25% against a backdrop of continued tonic secretion. And so when we talk about PTH secretory dynamics, we talk about a baseline secret, like insulin, like a lot of hormones. The parathyroid glands are always secreting parathyroid hormone. There is the circadian dynamics, and then there is this stochastic pulsatility. All right. Now, the calcium-sensing receptor is important in this whole scheme. The calcium-sensing receptor idea was born of some work that was done by Ed Brown in 1973, 4, 5, when he was a clinical associate at the NIH. And Ed, who recently retired from the Brigham, had a distinguished career, in terms of identifying this calcium-sensing receptor and the diseases associated with it. He reasoned, and nobody, it's sort of one of these really bright ideas and novel at the time, that there had to be a receptor system that recognized calcium. And in those days, receptors were just beginning to be thought of in terms of hormones. But an ion, a divalent ion, acting like a ligand, where there would be a molecule that it would recognize, that was really weird. And Ed spent about 2, 3, 4 years just sort of dreaming about this idea, and ultimately he, of course, showed that there was a molecule, the calcium-sensing receptor. And this is it. It looks like a hormone receptor. It's got an extracellular domain. It's got the 7G protein motif in the membrane itself, and then, of course, it has the intracellular domain. And there are different ligands. The divalent cations are the type 1 ligands, and there are others that cause some allosteric interactions. But the idea of the calcium-sensing receptor is that it transmits a signal, as all hormone receptors do, as a perturbation of a function. And in this case, the serum calcium in the blood, the ionized calcium, would go up for whatever reason. And this signal is transmitted both in terms of the receptor itself, as well as some direct trafficking not related to the receptor. And the net effect is to increase the intracellular ionized calcium. Obviously, this is the parathyroid cell. And the parathyroid system, transcription system, would be immediately suppressed, as well as the secretory system. So you can shut off PTH like that. Just raise the serum calcium, and the circulating PTH will immediately fall. It immediately falls because secretion is blocked, and the half-life of PTH is about, 20 seconds? Something like that. So if you stop an influx of parathyroid hormone, what's circulating will immediately be metabolized, and you'll see a drop. So this is a very exquisite system. Now, conversely, if the ionized calcium were to drop, the opposite would happen. There would be a reduction in the intracellular serum ionized calcium, and that would trigger, through transcriptional mechanisms and secretory mechanisms, an increase in parathyroid hormone. Okay? So here's the kind of schematic. This is the calcium-sensing receptor. Here is the ionized calcium in the extracellular space. And if there were reason for the calcium to drop, immediately you have a secretory, dynamic parathyroid hormone is secreted. If you had an antagonist of that calcium receptor blocking the signal, you would have a similar issue. So a calciolytic would stimulate parathyroid hormone secretion. A calcimimetic would do the opposite. It would behave like ionized calcium and facilitate the signal and reduce the parathyroid hormone. So calcimimetics we know about in terms of cinacalcet. Calciolytics we don't know too much about. There are some molecules that are being developed potentially as a treatment, but not yet developed. Okay? So there are genetic abnormalities of the calcium receptor. Calcium activating mutations would lead to a functional hypoparathyroidism, and inactivation of that calcium receptor would lead to various forms of hyperparathyroidism. You're also quiet. Am I being so clear? Yeah? All right. All right, so if we activate the calcium receptor, we can do it by, there are mutations that then disturb that interaction. There are activating antibodies against the calcium receptor, and I mentioned before, we have a drug, cinacalcet, that acts like a mimetic. It is a calcium, it's recognized by the calcium sensing receptor as calcium, although it's obviously not calcium. And in these three situations, the serum calcium will fall and the parathyroid hormone level. So people who have activating mutations of the calcium receptor, that is a form, really, of hypoparathyroidism. Okay? And this is the kind of thing with autosomal dominant hypoparathyroidism. Here's the wild type. This is a relationship between the serum calcium and the response. And obviously, these people are shifted to the left. They're much more sensitive to calcium. And they will be at a lower serum calcium concentration. Their parathyroid hormone will be shut off. On the other hand, if you inactivate the calcium receptor, and again, inactivating mutations, we know about them. Rarely there have been antibodies described against the receptor. And again, these molecules that we call calciolytics, in all these situations, what they do is they block that signal, and that leads to a stimulation of an apparent reduction in the intracellular serum, cellular calcium, and that would lead to a stimulation of parathyroid hormone. And then you know the hypercalcemias, the inactivating mutations. There is the FHH, which is the heterozygote condition that people talk about all the time. By the way, have any of you, I will ask the rhetorical question. But has any of you seen FHH? You have seen FHH? Proved, without a doubt, by genetic analysis, or just by clinical?
I know Dr. Volk says some patients.
Anybody else? I make the quip, and forgive me for this quip, but the only cases of FHH are really seen at NIH. That's a joke, of course. But Steve Marks, who recently retired, I have so many cases of, I would send patients to him because he's interested in FHH. And also he was interested in multiple endocrine neoplasia. And in those days, before we had good localization technology elsewhere, now of course we have very good imaging technology. I would send my patients to Steve, and he would come back and say, "You missed the diagnosis. Patient has FHH." Invariably. It's not possible. Not possible. And so I stopped sending patients to Steve. But it is a rare disease. But NIH saw them because they were sent to Steve. And obviously, you're going to have a bias, a sample bias. But when we say you have to rule out FHH when we're talking about hyperpara, yes, we do. But there are certain features of FHH that are easily known, ruled out, and it doesn't take a referral to NIH to know whether or not the patient has FHH. Nevertheless, there is this entity. We know. And it's due to the heterozygote loss of one of those mutations on the calcium receptor. And of course, much more severe is the homozygous condition where patients are really, these are little kitties, neonatal severe hyperparathyroidism is clearly something, again, very rare, but is recognized. So these are more, I would say, experiments of nature. They've taught us a lot about the receptor system, but in terms of everyday clinical importance, these are relatively unimportant when you consider how unusual it is to see either the heterozygote or the homozygote condition. Okay, so FHH is, again, reduced sensitivity. Here's the wild type. And looking at the calcium, ionized calcium, it takes much more to control the parathyroid hormone by virtue of this reduced sensitivity to the calcium-sensing receptor. Okay, So let's now switch into the other hormone. This other hormone will always be called 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. It will always be called a vitamin, and there's no way the lexicon is going to change. But we all know that it's a classic hormone. One point about, I failed to mention that. We'll talk about 125 in a moment. But the other point I was going to make is that the other regulator of the parathyroid hormone secretory system is 1,25-dihydroxy. So you really have two regulators. The most important one is the ionized calcium, and the also important is 1,25-dihydroxy. So you have one hormone, 125, controlling another hormone. And as you all know, we're going to talk about, you have parathyroid hormone controlling 125. So each of these hormones controls the other. Okay, so the major functions of parathyroid hormone? Yes?
Sorry, a quick question. How often do you see the antibodies that you mentioned against the receptors?
Very rarely. They're almost a case report. I have never seen it. Yeah. Has anybody seen the antibody? They're basically case reports. And again, these are experiments of nature, so you don't have to look for it. Okay, so the major functions of parathyroid hormone: bone remodeling. When you go up to Helen Hayes next week, make sure that David Dempster discusses with you the difference between bone remodeling and bone modeling. Okay? So our pediatricians here, where's our pediatricians? We have, oh, right. So so children model and adults don't. At least that's the dogma. So what does modeling mean? Modeling means bone growth on quiescent surfaces. It's okay? Bone remodeling is a function of bone replacement of surfaces that are already turning over. Now the adult typically doesn't grow its skeleton. It already has a grown skeleton. So quiescent surfaces are not targets for parathyroid hormone under usual circumstances. Remodeling is the way the adult renews its skeleton. It gets signals, and who knows what they are, to take a little bite out of a piece of bone. That osteoclast is activated, and that little lacuna is developed, the bone remodeling unit, and there is a replacement of that divot of bone by the type 1 collagen that is secreted by the osteoblasts that come in. And at the end of the day, 5 months later, you have replaced that little unit of old bone with a unit of new bone, with the amount being lost being replaced exactly by the amount being added in the context of a normal, well-balanced bone remodeling system. Okay? Bone modeling is truly bone formation on quiescent surfaces. In the adult, parathyroid hormone is important for bone remodeling. Obviously, it helps to control the serum calcium and the phosphate. Parathyroid hormone is a classic phosphaturic hormone, and it stimulates phosphorus excretion. And in the old days, hyperparathyroidism was a disease characterized by high calcium and a low phosphorus. These days, we almost never see a low phosphorus for two reasons. One, we don't measure the phosphorus. It's not part of the chem panel. So you have to say, you know, I want the phosphorus measured, or you're not going to even see it. But if you do measure the phosphorus, it typically is low normal, but unusually is it under 3 milligrams per deciliter. So it isn't that, because the disease has changed, and its phenotype isn't the way it used to be. But in the old days, serum calcium was high, phosphorus was low. And then, as I mentioned before, it stimulates the 1-alpha hydroxylase in the kidney to facilitate the conversion of 25-hydroxyvitamin D to 1,25-dihydroxy. Okay, so getting back to this easy diagram, what we have is a hormone that causes calcium mobilization from bone and calcium conservation at the renal tubule. And these two effects of parathyroid hormone will increase the serum calcium. And under normal circumstances, that is operative when the serum calcium dips. If the serum calcium is normal and parathyroid hormone does this, this is an abnormal situation, and you would have a situation of hypercalcemia. The arrows at the GI tract, because there really isn't very good evidence that parathyroid hormone has any direct actions on the GI tract. It's primarily the skeleton and the kidney. All right? So let's go to 1,25-dihydroxy. So this is the sequence that you all know so well. You know parent vitamin D, which is a very inactive molecule, gets converted in the liver to 25-hydroxy vitamin D, and this molecule gets further converted in the kidney to 1,25-dihydroxy. 25-hydroxy vitamin D has some activity, but not nearly, more so than parent vitamin D, but not nearly as much as the active molecule. You may wonder, there are other molecules. Why are we satisfied that there is 125 and there's not 124-25 and such? Well, there are. There are lots of subsequent molecules that the body makes. But most everyone agrees that the principal biologically active form of vitamin D is 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. This work was done, all of this is relatively recent, I mean in my lifetime. This sequence was beautifully elucidated by Hector De Luca in the late 1960s, 1969, 1970. You know, before then, we didn't know anything about vitamin D metabolism. Vitamin D was vitamin D. So it's just really brilliant, brilliant work that elucidated this pathway. You'll notice that there are no items listed on this arrow to suggest that there is any control of the production of 25-hydroxy vitamin D. And that's because there are no controls. If you give the liver any amount of vitamin D, if the liver is normal, it will quantitatively make 25-hydroxy. And it's the way it is. So I say the kidney is really smart and the liver is really dumb. It doesn't have a way of controlling the production of 25. On the other hand, the kidney, it has some interesting controls. Parathyroid hormone stimulates the 1-alpha-hydroxylase. Phosphorus will inhibit the 1-alpha-hydroxylase. Calcium, when it goes up, will inhibit the 1-alpha-hydroxylase. And there's a feedback loop here. So 125 will control itself in terms of it preventing its further accumulation. So this is the reason why in vitamin D toxicity, and this is a favorite board question, by the way, pretty easy for you guys, I would expect. But in vitamin D toxicity, that is from ingestion of vitamin D, the pharmacologically active principle that is responsible for hypercalcemia is not 125-dihydroxy vitamin D. I don't know how many, have you seen cases of vitamin D toxicity? Anyway, if you did, what you would see would be obviously hypercalcemia. You measure the 25-hydroxy, and it would be very high. You measure the 125-dihydroxy, and it may be just a little bit above the upper limits of normal, but by no means is it really high. And when you get to levels of 200, 300, and 400 nanograms per ml of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, you see pharmacological activity of 25. Ordinarily, you don't. But when the levels get that high with vitamin D toxicity, you will see it. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had an epidemic of vitamin D toxicity here. People came in, and their calciums were 15, 16. PTHs were completely suppressed. 25-hydroxy was sky high. And couldn't figure out what was going on. So we found out eventually and published on this. In the community, we have a heavily Dominican community here in Washington Heights. And a homeopath, so-called, was available in the local drugstores. And this homeopath was called Soladex. It was a little vial, 5 cc vial, clear, colorless. And it was, the instructions were to take the whole vial, drink it. If you had a cold, headache, sore toe, or for anything, and you would take it every day until you felt better. Okay, so we then looked on the bottle, and it actually had the ingredients. And the vitamin D, it said there were 500,000 units of vitamin D. And there's also a lot of vitamin A in this little bottle. So we actually had it assayed. And it wasn't 500,000, it was almost 1 million. It was 833,000 units in each of these vials. So people were just taking it, and that's an easy way to get vitamin D toxicity. So our fellows are trained to ask that question whenever anybody comes in with hypercalcemia. We don't see it anymore, but it used to be rampant in Washington Heights. And it was only $5, very cheap. So people would just buy it and take it. So that's that. But the question is, in vitamin D toxicity, it's 25-hydroxy. And you all know that when we measure vitamin D and look for its adequacy or inadequacy, we measure the 25-hydroxy. Now, do you know why we measure the 25 and not parent vitamin D or 125? I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would we measure a precursor that is relatively inactive as an index of vitamin D adequacy when, after all, it's the 125 that's the active principle? Good, good. Do you know the difference in the half-lives between the 3 molecules? No? But you're right, it is the half-life. The half-life, and as a result, the proclivity to be picked up by fat. So the lipophilicity or whatever is a function. So here you have molecules that become less and less lipophilic as you become more polar. So the hydroxy groups make these molecules more polar. So 125-dihydroxy has polar hydroxyl groups. So it is not lipophilic. So 125-dihydroxy does not accumulate in fat to any degree. And the half-life is about 6 to 8 hours. So it's a little bit like T3. You know, the half-life of T3 is much faster than the half-life of T4, and we typically use T4 measurements as an index, well, TSH more than T4. So 125-dihydroxy is not a good index of vitamin D sufficiency. 25-hydroxy, on the other hand, is stored in fat. It has a half-life of about 3 weeks. So, so that is what we have been using. Vitamin D is a harder assay, and nobody measures vitamin D. Theoretically, you could, but 25-hydroxy seems to be more reasonable. The assays are very well standardized now after some discussions that led to a standardized, centralized lab in England that on a regular basis gets samples from all the big commercial labs and ascertains the quality control of the 25-hydroxy assay. There was a problem about 10 years ago when Quest gave different values from LabCorp, from the Mayo Clinic, and the commercial labs were just a mess. Now you can pretty much believe a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level, no matter where you send your sample to. One other thing about the fat issue, I don't think Michaela will bring this up tomorrow, but in people who are taking large amounts of vitamin D, and that would relate more specifically to the people with hypoparathyroidism. Some of these people need hundreds of thousands of units of vitamin D a day. The 25-hydroxy accumulates in fat. Really just, it's like a sponge. And for reasons that nobody understands, occasionally there will be some stimulus to just release all that 25-hydroxy from fat. And so these people who have been very well controlled for years can become vitamin D toxic. It's really funny, not funny, it's a very serious condition. And you really are dealing with very serious vitamin D toxicity that can go on for a long period of time. I had one patient, one of the original patients in the study of Fuller Albright. She was published in 1947. It's one of the first 7 cases of hypoparathyroidism. She was a wonderful woman. She passed away a few years ago. But she taught generations of our fellows about hypopara, because she was always coming into the hospital for one reason or another. But I remember once she was in the hospital for 3 months with unremitting, severe vitamin D toxicity. It was all the fat vitamin D just coming out. But we don't see it too much anymore because, of course, we have, hopefully we'll have more patients on PTH for hypopara. Okay, so what does 125 do? It facilitates calcium and phosphate absorption by independent mechanisms. It is also important in bone remodeling. Again, this is different from the pediatric world, where vitamin D is also important for bone modeling, of course. And it regulates parathyroid hormone. By the way, we're going to give you these slides. What we'll do is put them on a little memory stick, and there will be a complaint. You'll say, it took too long to get the slides. My colleagues are wonderful, but they're not very good about giving me their slides. But we will put them in a PDF format so you'll have them for your own collection. Okay, so 125-dihydroxy works like parathyroid hormone on bone to stimulate egress of calcium. And it also works directly on the GI tract to absorb calcium. And it doesn't really have much of an effect on the kidney directly. Now, I mentioned yesterday this whole issue of vitamin D deficiency. This is work from Mike Hollick that looked at the United States and divided the United States in tertiles of latitude. And it really didn't matter too much what latitude of U.S. he was sampling from, the northern, the middle, or the lower. You might expect the lower countries, the lower latitude countries, to have a lower incidence of vitamin D insufficiency, and maybe, but still pretty significant, 24%, 42%, 35%. Of individuals as defined by a 25-hydroxy of less than 30 nanograms per ml or 82 nanomoles per liter. So it's an interesting discussion about why is there such an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency. The first you consider is the sun. You can say, what's wrong with the sun? Well, here's the sun. And for the past week in New York, we didn't see the sun. New York is unusual. We have an interesting climate in New York. It's either good weather or bad weather. You know, it's almost never cloudy all week. Like in Boston, it's always cloudy in Boston. And in Seattle, it's always cloudy. I don't know about British Columbia. The weather is cloudy all the time? Yeah. But in New York, we have beautiful weather or terrible weather. But the past week has been cloudy. So the sun shines. But the sun shines at different angles. That is, the energy hits this part of the Earth or any other part of the Earth, unless you're at the equator, with a different angle such that the energy wavelength you need to convert pre-vitamin D or 7-dihydrocholesterol in the skin to pre-vitamin D requires a wavelength of like up to 95 to 110 nanometers that doesn't hit the Earth during the wintertime. Okay? So here in New York or in Boston or British Columbia in the winter, your skin, you go out in the sun. There's a sunny day in January. And those rays from the sun don't have the wavelength that hits the Earth or your skin to convert pre-vitamin D to vitamin D. And in northern climes like 38, 40, 42 degrees and northern latitudes, the seasonal exposure can be very limiting. So in this part of the world, from about October to April, the sun is not a source of vitamin D. In the equator, of course, it is. When you get to the Arctic, rarely, a couple of months, and that's it. So to a certain extent, this is latitude dependent. The dermatologists are phobic about the sun. And to a certain extent, they're right. The sun's bad. It'll ruin your skin. It can cause skin cancer. It's obviously associated with melanoma, particularly in children who have been exposed to the sun, but it's also true beyond the formative years. Exposure to sun can be a risk factor for melanoma. And you've seen people who have spent their lives in the sun, their skin is a mess, it's leathery, it's dark, and just poorly complected. Cultural, we were talking about the cultural parts of the world. People are completely covered, and I'm not convinced that that's a factor. The men in Saudi Arabia are just as vitamin D deficient as the women. And you could say, well, the men are covered also, and to a certain extent they are, but they aren't, not necessarily. And Western dress is appearing in Saudi Arabia. And I don't know. Cultural maybe, but I'm not sure that's a major factor. Environmental. Have any of you been to Beijing recently? Well, wear a mask. You never see the sun in Beijing. It is a sunny day in Beijing is a cloudy day, unfortunately. When I was in Korea a couple of weeks ago, they have a different kind of pollution. It's not that you can't see the sun, but there are so many particulate things in the atmosphere that you actually don't see it hazy, but it really is hazy. So environmental pollution in so many cities in the world are limiting. And then, of course, the dermatologists, again, are saying, don't go near the sun. So lots of reasons why the sun has been eclipsed as a source of vitamin D. And it's throughout the world, really. Now, do we have evidence that vitamin D is deficient throughout the world? We do. But before we get to that, so how else can we get vitamin D? If we don't get it from sunlight, well, how about food? Okay, we get vitamin D from food. Well, not really. Not really. Here's the amount of vitamin D in various foods. Cod liver oil. By the way, do you know why this 400-unit nutrient recommendation is now changed? But why it was 400 is because in 1 teaspoon of cod liver oil, there's 400 units. That's how they came up with. You take 1 teaspoon of cod liver oil a day, you're cured of rickets for sure. That's all you need to cure yourself of rickets. And that's how this nomenclature came. Okay, salmon has a little bit. mackerel, fortified milk, but not all countries fortify milk with vitamin D. Obviously, many cereals are fortified. Liver, nobody eats liver anymore, I don't think. Everybody eat liver anymore? Liver used to be, when I grew up, the liver was a okay food. Now, can you imagine eating liver? And egg have liver. Okay, so this is from US data about 10 years ago from the NH3, looking at men and women at various ages and their average intake of vitamin D. And you can see very low, 300 across the board, well under what used to be the recommendation of 400 units per day. So we don't have sunlight as a source. We don't have food as a source. So we all should be D deficient, right? And here is work from Neil Binkley at University of Wisconsin, where he showed that 60% of this sample of 71 women had levels of 25-hydroxy that were less than 30 nanograms per ml. 60%. And this is work from Bob Heaney again, showing that most Americans are not receiving adequate D. In those days, it was 400 units. 70% of women, and even higher, were not getting adequate amounts of vitamin D, whether it be from the diet or the supplement. This is a nice paper from Paul Lips, where he sampled 18 countries at the latitudes of 38 south to 64 north, so a big swath of the latitude of the world. And he found that 64% of this populous convenience sample had 25-hydroxy levels of less than 30 nanograms per ml. And if you do this now by region, this graph somehow lost its bottoms, but it doesn't matter. But Latin America, Europe, Middle East, Asia, Australia, look at these percentages. You know, the lowest is 53 up to 81% in the Middle East have levels of 25-hydroxy that are under 30 nanograms per ml. And overall, this was the figure of Paul Lips, 64% worldwide. So the chances are that 2/3 of us in this room are vitamin D deficient unless we take vitamin D. So I have to ask you a personal question. I'll give you my answer. Do I take vitamin D? Yeah, I take vitamin D. I take 2,000 units a day. If you take vitamin D, raise your hand. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, so a good percentage of you take vitamin D. Good for you. Is that because you have measured your vitamin D and it was low, or that you think it's a good thing to do? Okay, well, both are right. If you measured, it would have been low, and you're taking one. So that is very good, because if you weren't taking D, likely that you'd be D deficient. So this gets to the question of what are we aiming for when we say we take vitamin D, and what's the magic number? What do we want to say that we are vitamin D adequate? It used to be 10 nanograms per ml was the laboratory lower limit, and I'll explain why that used to be. But the big controversy is 20 nanograms per ml or 30 nanograms per ml. And before I get into this discussion, how many of you vote? No one's going to vote for 10. How many of you will vote for 20 nanograms per ml as the figure that we should aim for as an adequate level for our patients? You? Okay, good. How many of you vote for 30? Oh, it's interesting. Very interesting. Any of you vote for 40? No, you haven't considered 40? Okay. And anybody for 10? No, okay. So the majority are in the 30 camp. That's interesting. None of you are from Maine, that's for sure. I'll tell you why Maine is of note. By the way, do you want to take a break? Are you okay? We can take a break. We don't have, this is not a is a sort of a boot camp where you have to prove yourself that you can last for 2 hours. If it's okay, we can go or we can stop. You want to go? Keep going. If you have to, you can obviously leave any time. Let me see what's happening. So, okay, there's a little bit of, but I have a meeting at 11, so I have to stop at 11. Okay. All right, well, why don't we keep going? But people have to take off for a minute or so, that's fine. Okay. So the laboratory reference range, as I mentioned before, you take a bunch of people off the street and you measure it, and in the old days, the average level was around 10 plus or minus. So the labs initially would say, all right, 10 is normal because that's the normal population. But we don't take that anymore. So what about the physiology? Can we define this by the relationship of vitamin D to parathyroid hormone? And this is a very interesting paper that was published years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. It looked at vitamin D deficiency in medical inpatients. It was a study from the Mass General of previously healthy men, predominantly men, who came into the Mass General emergency room with chest pain. And while they were being evaluated in the emergency room, a sample was taken for 25-hydroxy. And this is what they showed, that in this cross-sectional study, looking at the 25-hydroxy level and in relationship to parathyroid hormone, you saw that around here, 30 nanograms per ml, this curve starts to go up. Now, you could argue that between 20 and 30, there isn't much of a difference. But below 20, there's a huge increase in parathyroid hormone. So this experiment could give you strength to say 30 is the magic number or 20 is the magic number. So the thinking here was that it could be either 30 or 20 based on that paper. That paper, by the way, there were many co-authors of that paper. And I've always been struck by that paper because every one of those co-authors, except for one, was a House officer. That group of authors were residents at the Mass General. And they took it upon themselves to do this study, and they got a paper published in the New England Journal. So I thought that was noteworthy. Okay. So the third possibility is that we should look at it not so much in terms of hormone regulation, but its relationship to optimal calcium absorption. Take a real physiological piece. And this, again, is work from Bob Heaney, and in which he looked at calcium absorption. And you can do calcium absorption studies. It's not so easy to do. In subjects who were vitamin D repleted or not. And the average 25-hydroxy level in those who were vitamin D replete was 35 nanograms per ml. And the group that wasn't vitamin D replete was 20. Okay? And he showed that the group that was replete had a 65% greater calcium absorption than the group that was not. And this shows you the area under the curve of calcium absorption was 65% greater in the group that had been pre-dosed with vitamin D. And as you would expect, in the group that had higher levels, this is nanomoles per liter, this is 35, the parathyroid hormone level was concomitantly reduced by that amount. So that fit, the higher the 25-hydroxy, the better the calcium absorption. And at 20, it was clearly not as good as at 35. And here's another interesting piece of work that Bob Heaney did, showing that at levels of 25-hydroxy, up to 80 or so nanograms per ml, that's about 32 nanograms per ml, or 80 nanomoles per liter, calcium absorption increases linearly and then plateaus thereafter. So this also makes an interesting point. So that maybe you want the 25-hydroxy level to be at a level where your calcium absorption is maximal. Okay, and one question you might have is, well, is there a limit to calcium absorption? Well, obviously there is, and it's because calcium is a nutrient with these kinetics. That is, it has a dose-response relationship. The more calcium you give, the more calcium you'll absorb, even if your vitamin D is max, up to a certain limit, and then the threshold is reached and you have no more. So it's called a threshold nutrient. It isn't a matter of the more calcium you give, the more calcium you'll absorb forever. No, there's a limit, and that limit, Bob Heaney showed, is about 1,500 milligrams. So for a given adequate amount of 25-hydroxy vitamin D, you increase calcium supplements or in the diet up to a certain amount, and thereafter it plateaus. So that gives another reason for saying, we want everyone to get calcium, enough calcium, but 2,500 milligrams of calcium is not better than 1,500. So for those naysayers who think if you take calcium you're going to have a heart attack, there are people who believe that, although the evidence is very poor. There's no reason to take 2,500 milligrams of calcium because you're not getting any benefit. And if there is any downside, I don't think there is, at least within reasonable amounts of calcium. But why even think about a downside if you don't have to get there? Okay, so what I've told you so far seems like 32 nanograms per ml is a good threshold value for adequacy. And then in 2010, the Institute of Medicine, a very prestigious group, had a task force, and they reviewed all the data. And the task force included one of my best friends, Cliff Rosen, who's in Bangor, Maine. And they came up with the following statements. There is no convincing evidence that PTH levels rise consistently when the 25-hydroxy level falls below 30. So that paper I showed you from Thomas, it's not absolutely clear. There's no convincing evidence that optimal calcium balance requires a 25-hydroxy level greater than 30. So they took issue with Dr. Heaney's wonderful paper. They furthermore said there's no convincing evidence that skeletal health requires levels greater than 30. They said there was no convincing evidence that the putative non-skeletal effects of vitamin D are first substantiated and two, associated with 25 levels greater than 30. So what are these putative non-skeletal effects? Well, there are lots of them. There are people, and there are some data to suggest that it improves cognitive function. There are data to suggest, none of this is really strong, that it improves eyesight, people who have macular degeneration, that it improves glucose tolerance, that it improves balance. Now, there may be some evidence about balance, and there may be some evidence about muscle strength. But if there are data to those off-target organs, this group said that if so, we don't know that they're related to levels over 30. Rather, they said if the level is less than 20, then you have problems. So they made a big distinction between 30 and 20. And they came up with the recommendation that we should aim for levels of 20 nanograms per ml in our population. And that would be like 50 nanomoles per liter. Now, that's controversial, but this is not. We all agree that the recommended daily intake should go up from 400 to 600 in those under the age of 70 and up to 800 on a daily basis in those who are over 70. There is a sense that we need more vitamin D as we get older. There's a vitamin D resistance that seems to creep into our physiology as we get older. And they also said, and again, no one's arguing with this, unless there's a disease at hand. I have lots of patients who are taking more than 4,000 units a day, but for various reasons. But for a regular person, there is no need, and one shouldn't exceed a daily intake of more than 4,000 units. And again, they said aim for levels between 20 and 50. They put a ceiling on the circulating level of 50. Many of the laboratories, by the way, don't have a 50 upper. They go up to 80 or so. Well, the Institute of Medicine, while they took issue with the soft data about levels of 30, they didn't take issue with the soft data about levels over 50. And there are some soft data relating to all-cause mortality in people whose levels are over 50. But it's really soft. I mean, nobody really is convinced. Nevertheless, the Institute of Medicine said, don't go over 50. So they're a little inconsistent on the one end and then on the other. So here's where a lot of us stand, and here's where the Institute of Medicine suggested we go. So the Endocrine Society came forth with a recommendation that we don't accept the Institute of Medicine's guidelines, and that we stick with our guns, 30 to 100 nanograms per ml. And Bob Heaney and Mike Hollick had an editorial that was kind of cute, why the Institute of Medicine recommendations for vitamin D are deficient. That was cute. And they argued quite forcefully for maintaining the level of 30. So I am suggesting that we stick with 30. Now, there are two more reasons to stick with 30. This is from Neil Binkley, and he's concerned about the assay itself. It's still quite variable, of 20 to 30%. So if you want to assure a level of 20, if the variance of the assay is up to 30%, then somebody who has a level of 30 could actually have a level of 24 or closer to 20. So if you want to be sure you're not lower than 20, you ought to aim for 30. And if you want to aim for 30, he's saying you should aim for 40. In fact, Neil believes in 40 because of the assay issue. Your patient whose level is 40 may be closer to 30. Now, there's yet another argument, and this is my argument, and it gets to the population norm discussion again. If you want everybody in the population to be 20, that means that half the population will be under 20, right? If the mean is 20, a lot of people are going to be under 20. If you aim for 30, then half the population will be under 30. So if you say, well, 20 to 30 is not a big deal, but I am really upset about anybody under 20, then you should go for 30, definitely. And then if you take the Binkley argument, if you say, no, 30 is the number, I don't want anybody under 30, then you should go for 40. And there's nothing wrong with 40. But most of us are happy if patients are of 30. I have a lot of patients whose levels are between 30 and 35, and I say, this is fine. And they say, well, doctor, what's a normal range? And I said, well, it's 30 to 50. They say, yeah, but I'm only 31. That's barely normal. Yeah. And, well, don't you think I should be at 40? I said, well, yeah, but no, you got to be loose about this. So, but you are all on the, well, let me ask you, because you were on the 20. So after this discussion, are you going to join the group, or are you going to stick to your guns?
30.
You're going to go for there. Did you hear that? She's going to, you just told the world that you would join the group. Yeah, no, but it is controversial. I am surprised that all of you started off with the notion of 30, which I've agreed with all along. Yet you will hear people who say 20 is fun. Okay, this is just a wrap-up of the physiology. And this is, like you all know, the serum, the ionized calcium drops, PTH goes up, 125 goes up, and then you have effects on the GI tract to improve calcium and phosphate through 125. And then with regard to this signal, you have a phosphaturic effect, which neutralizes that absorption effect of vitamin D, and you reduce the renal excretion, calcium conserving. So you're conserving calcium in the GI tract, you're conserving calcium in the renal system, and the net effect in this homeostatic network is to restore that stimulus of a low calcium by bringing it up. And that's sort of the simple way of this working. Okay? So, how many of you measure, NIH excluded, how many of you measure, no, tell me, no, I'm interested in what the NIH does. I love the NIH. But I know for years, ionized calcium, it's what you measure. Is that what you still measure? No? You measure total calcium? Wow, that's a change. For years.
The clinical practice more so. I mean,
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, how many of you measure ionized calcium routinely in your hospitals? No, you do. Where are you from? Oh, I'm sorry, Rebecca. Well, you're pediatrics. Yeah, yeah. Well, the peds people are different. Yeah, that's right. You're right. You do measure ionized calcium, but those of us on the other side of the street, no. Well, we'll give you the argument for why. I know why you measure ionized calcium. You can measure it because you have a calibrated instrument, which is always on. You also know how to draw the blood. You know how to keep it anaerobic before it gets to the lab. And you know that when you, as soon as you unstopper the tube, unless you have it already in the machine, the air will change the pH, and that'll change the ionized calcium. So those are your arguments. But for most, except for pediatrics, and again, you have a limitation in blood. That's another feature of pediatrics. But most of us will do the corrected calcium for albumin. And if you are able to measure ionized calcium, yeah, it is the physiology, that's a physiologically active component, and you could argue. But on the other hand, if you can correct with the albumin, you get a pretty good number. Okay. We're not going to talk today about gonadal steroids, glucocorticoids, thyroid hormone, growth hormone. We've got other potential regulators of calcium metabolism. We've got a lot of cytokines. We're going to touch on a lot of them as we go through, particularly the Wnt system. I'm going to make a comment about rank ligand, OPG. But we've got lots of molecules that have become very important. And rank, I just wanted to introduce you to as one of the important cytokines. So rank ligand was discovered, about 20 years ago. It was thought to be a product of the osteoblast, but now we know that it's perhaps more exclusively a product of the osteocyte. So rank ligand is a very powerful molecule. It binds to a receptor called rank. And rank is on the surface of the osteoclast here. And it also is on the surface of these progenitor cells, which are growing up to become active osteoclasts. And what rank ligand does is to activate the mature osteoclast or stimulate the differentiation of these primordial osteoclasts. There are many data to argue for its importance. The models in which you knock out the decoy system, the OPG system, thereby exaggerating the effect of rank, will lead to marked bone loss. This is in comparison to normal. The situation where you antagonize rank by virtue of a transgenic where you overproduce OPG, you get a sclerotic bone picture. And taking this even one step further, if there were no way of controlling rank ligand in the human body, we would not have a skeleton. We would all be jellyfish. It is that powerful. It's one of the most powerful, well, it's probably the most powerful ligand in terms of bone resorption in the universe. And it's remarkable that we just discovered it 20 years ago. It's been evolving for about 400 million years. We think we're so smart. And rank ligand has been implicated in a whole host of diseases. As I mentioned before, if we didn't have a controller of rank ligand, we wouldn't be in good shape. So the decoy receptor, osteoprotogerin, this green dumbbell, is a molecule that is specifically a receptor. It binds rank ligand, and by binding rank ligand, it prevents its interaction or reduces its interaction with its real receptor, which is rank. So the balance between OPG and rank ligand is in part going to determine whether we're in a resorptive mode or not. This information also, as you all know, led to the development of a drug that is specifically an anti-rank ligand molecule, and it's denosumab. Initially, OPG was thought to be a candidate molecule as a drug, but there were side effects with OPG, so that didn't ever pan out. But the idea was to bind rank ligand effectively and prevent its recognition at the receptor level, and thus we'll talk about the drug that was developed. All right? So this is the problem with hypercalcemia. Usually, any excess calcium loss from the skeleton that exceeds the ability of the kidney to handle the excess calcium load, that's a very big point, will lead to hypercalcemia. You could be in negative calcium balance as long as your kidneys can excrete it, then you're not going to become hypercalcemic. But at some point, this will lead to hypercalcemia. So these are obviously the two most common causes of hypercalcemia. Allegedly, and it's probably true, about 90%, 80 to 90% of all hypercalcemia is hyperpara or due to malignancy. And of course, it depends on where you are in the world. And if you're at Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson, you're going to see much more malignancy. But most hospitals, and certainly outpatient medicine, is going to be hyperpara. But then, we endocrinologists, we have a whole litany of other potential causes. And every once in a while, some of these causes have to be considered. The issue with lithium and thiazides, that this is important because we often see people on thiazide diuretics and obviously lithium as well. I have become convinced that if you see hypercalcemia in the presence of someone who's on lithium or thiazides, you're probably dealing with hyperparathyroidism. We used to say that lithium-induced hypercalcemia, thiazide-induced hypercalcemia, and stop the drug. If you can stop lithium, often you can't, the calcium will remit. But it's now very uncommon. I think these drugs are, well, lithium is probably a chronic stimulation that when patients become hypercalcemic, they remain hypercalcemic. And I think the thiazides are probably unmasking, if you will, a normal calcemic hyperpara. So those are important. We talked about vitamin D toxicity, certainly something to bear in mind. Any of the granulomatous diseases can be associated with hypercalcemia by virtue of the production of 125 dihydroxy, with the macrophages acquiring that 1-alpha hydroxylase capability. Lymphomas, FHH we've talked about, immobilization in the very young or the very old, not so much in the mid-range of adults. Acute or chronic renal disease, all can be causes. But this is a grab bag, and yeah, we see it occasionally, but most of the time we're dealing with hyperpara or malignancy. And this is a very old table from Greg Mundy, but it makes the point in his survey from Australia that of the numbers of subjects they studied, 90% were those who had hyperparathyroidism or malignancy. So Shani Silverberg is going to talk to you at length about hyperpara next week, but just to introduce the topic, it's one of our common endocrine disorders, and we say it's due to incompletely regulated excessive secretion of parathyroid hormone from one or more of the 4 parathyroid glands. 80% of our adults have a single benign adenoma. 15 to 20% of our adults have multi-gland disease. And very, very rarely, the figures are like 0.5% of the hyperpara population have a malignancy. I don't think there's time to give you a whole talk on parathyroid cancer. It's really an interesting topic, but very, very rare, and something that almost never enters into our differential diagnosis from a clinical point of view. If it does, we're dealing with a different kind of hyperparathyroidism, and that should be clinically apparent with much more active disease. And this is an introduction to what isn't true anymore. Hyperparathyroidism is associated with hypercalcemia and elevated levels of parathyroid hormone. Well, those are the biochemical hallmarks of hyperparathyroidism. And yeah, we see hypercalcemia and we see elevated levels of parathyroid hormone. But we see people with hypercalcemia and normal levels of parathyroid hormone a lot. And we know they have hyperparathyroidism because the parathyroid hormone level is easily detectable. And it shouldn't be easily detectable, shouldn't be detectable at all if the hypercalcemia is due to a non-parathyroid hormone-dependent hypercalcemia. Some people have asked me, well, how low can you go? Is a parathyroid hormone level of 21 picograms per ml with a normal range of 10 to 65 compatible with a diagnosis of primary hyperpara? What would you say? Yes, no. Is it too low? It's got to be something else? Well, that's a tough one. It is tough. I agree it's tough. But if you want to be a purist and you believe in your assay and the patient doesn't have renal failure, you have to really exclude renal failure, that's not normal. If your calcium goes up, your PTH becomes undetectable. That's the way it is. So if it's 21, that is easily detectable. And I mentioned 21 because that's, I think, the lowest value in the literature that has been associated with surgically proved hyperparathyroidism. But theoretically, it could be a little lower, not much lower. The other thing that you might want to bear in mind with regard to low levels, unusually low levels of parathyroid hormone is someone who you are sure has hyperparathyroidism. And I ask this question now regularly of my patients whose levels are in that very low range, based upon a paper that was published in Endocrine Practice not too long ago. Ask about whether the patient is taking biotin. Biotin is very, allegedly, good for your fingernails and good for your hair. That's why I take it. I don't take biotin. But a lot of women take biotin. And anyway, so what biotin does is interfere with the PTH assay. And this paper showed that there was such an example of someone who had hypercalcemia, undetectable levels of parathyroid hormone, and when she stopped, there were 2 or 3 cases. When the biotin was stopped after 3 or 4 weeks, parathyroid hormone was easily detectable and the diagnosis of hyperpara could be made. So bear that in mind as you think about the levels that are low. And of course, the other point about this biochemical definition is now we recognize that there are people who have perfectly normal serum calcium levels, high PTHs, and no obvious reason for a secondary hyperparathyroidism. So this biochemical definition now has morphed into a little bit of a variance here, both in terms of what the calcium level may be and what the parathyroid hormone level may be. But this is more the classical situation. These Ps are people who have surgically proved disease, and they all had hypercalcemia in this particular series years ago, and with several patients having PTH levels that are in the upper range of normal, but clearly abnormal for the hypercalcemia. And these Ts represent people with hypercalcemia malignancy in whom the PTH is almost always suppressed. And these people who have suppressed parathyroid hormone levels and a malignancy have obviously a different syndrome. This is the hypercalcemia malignancy syndrome. Going way back, this was an example of someone who had an ovarian tumor, and she was hypercalcemic until she had her ovarian tumor removed, and you can see how dramatically the calcium dropped. And it was actually Fuller Albright in the 1940s, examples like this, in which he hypothesized that these tumors were making parathyroid hormone. So he identified the syndrome. He did not identify the molecule, although he had questions about whether it was PTH. He had done some bioassay, and it wasn't behaving like authentic PTH. This is in the 1940s. And the guy was a brilliant man. And he said, gee, well, it's like PTH. And in terms, it's very true. It's like PTH. And here it is, PTHRP, which has interesting homology, particularly, this is the one sequence, this is all the pro stuff. But if you look at the homology of PTHRP and the various PTHs, there are 4 comparative PTHs, you'll see that there's good sequence homology out to about residue 15 or 16. And then you see PTHRP begin to look very different from the other PTHs. PTHRP then is really a completely different molecule in many ways. And this is a molecule that has a much larger molecular weight. It has 140 or more, depends on the species, amino acids. We're going to talk next week, or I think next week, about this molecule PTHRP, in which out to residue 22, the molecule sequence was maintained, and then between residues 22 and 34, there were empirically inserted residues so as to maximize PTHRP's anabolic properties. And hence a new molecule was formed called abaloparatide, which is now under review by the FDA for the treatment of osteoporosis. But PTHRP was discovered in the context of hypercalcemia of malignancy, and clearly it is important, and these are some of the characteristics that led to the discovery and the assertion that PTHRP was an important cause of hypercalcemia malignancy. And these are the tumors that are classically seen: squamous cell cancer mostly, sometimes adenocarcinoma, less so breast cancer, and certainly myeloma and other lymphomatous type malignancies you see not PTHRP. There have been other molecules like IGF-1, IGF-6, interleukin-1, not IGF, interleukin-1, interleukin-6 that have been associated with hypercalcemia. PTHRP is an omnipresent molecule. It's present in many, many tissues in different species. You can see the human has PTHRP in virtually every organ and cell system you look at. It has a physiology. It's involved in a number of different systems under normal circumstances, like lactation, placental calcium transport, and the like, smooth muscle function, central nervous system function. So PTHRP is not just a molecule that is expressed in hypercalcemia, but seen in many tissues and has many different functions. We touched upon these other causes of hypercalcemia. I don't think there's a need to address any of the others because we really talked about them. So let's just go for, oh, actually we better stop. Why don't we stop here, and this afternoon we'll finish up on the clinical manifestations of hypercalcemia, how we manage hypercalcemia, and then we'll talk about hypocalcemia and introduce you to the discussion tomorrow on hypoparathyroidism. So this afternoon, yeah?
Quick question. I remember I read a really old article that suggested that sometimes you actually see hypocalcemia of malignancy or hypocalcemia with malignancy. Has that been something that you've noticed?
Yeah, hypocalcemia of malignancy. Yeah, it's rare. It's very rare. I may have seen one case. So it is a situation of where you have osteoblastic metastases. So the two diseases where you would see it would be breast cancer and prostate cancer. And there is a very small literature in which patients became hypocalcemic by virtue of a tremendous influx of calcium into the skeleton by virtue of the osteoblastic effect. Yeah, so there is an entity, very rare, very rare. I don't think has anyone seen it? You've seen it? Good.
Prostate cancer.
Yeah, prostate, well, yeah, and probably overwhelming metastatic prostate cancer. Other questions? Okay, so this afternoon you're going to meet with Michael Yin, and he's going to talk to you about HIV and bone, and then Ed Guo is going to introduce you to bone biomechanics, and I'll finish up with our discussion today. And then there are neuroendocrine rounds. Rebecca, did you find the room?
So technically that's the correct room.
Oh, really?
information, But it's confusing because one step away from the black building starts. So I show them where it is and I can show them this way.
Okay, okay. I thought the Goodman,
It says it outside the room, which is news
All
to
right.
me.
all right. Well, you know where it is, so that's good. Okay, very good. So we'll see you soon.